Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Annalisa and I am autistic. I'm pretty sure I'm going to title this video the Autism and Books tag. I searched up on the internet trying to see if there was another autistic related book tag. Couldn't find one, so here we go. I was thinking about calling it the autistic book tag, but I thought that might make people think they had to be autistic to do it, and you don't. Obviously, I hope that a lot of autistic booktubers decide to do it because there are several autistic people on BookTube, and I will be tagging a couple of them who have talked about it publicly on their channel. But I would also like to just raise awareness of what autism actually is, and so I would also really love it for all my neurotypical friends and also my neurodivergent friends who have things other than autism going on with them to also do it and hopefully enjoy it. So basically I'm going to go through some symptoms that are common across the autistic spectrum and also just some things that are common among us, and give you prompts to talk about books or book characters who have something to do with those. I'm also going to expand on each one and kind of tell you about why I made that prompt and how this symptom manifests differently across the spectrum. If you do this tag, no need to repeat all that. I will be typing out below the questions with like just enough explanation that they make sense. So you can just use those if you want. If you are an autistic booktuber, feel free to expand and put your own views in. But let's get started. I'll start with the caveat that I only figured out that I was autistic about a year and a few months ago, and I've only been researching it since a little bit before then. So if you're an autistic person who has been researching it for like 5 to 10 years, you probably do know more than me, and I won't be offended if you correct me nicely. But let's get started. So it has been said, specifically by Stephanie Bethany, who runs a autism-centric channel that I'll link below, that trying to get the autistic community to do anything as a group or agree on anything is like herding cats, and we get very picky about stuff like language and how we should react to things in public. We can't even agree on a symbol to use. Some of us like the neurodivergent squiggly thing, some of us aren't that into it, some of us think the puzzle piece is great, some of us really hate it. We do agree on some things, such as that Autism Speaks is bad. This prompt is, tell us about a book that has characters that have a difficult / frustrating time getting along together / working together. So a lot of times in books there will be a number of characters in the little main characters group that will work together to get to some goal. Sometimes they're an already formed team at the beginning of the book, sometimes they form during the book, but a lot of times a lot of them have such complementary skills and personalities that they make up a whole really well. But sometimes, even if they do have complementing powers, they have conflicting personalities and they get along quite badly. And an excellent example of this that I just finished reading is The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. And this is a book in which the 5 or 6 main characters represent different boroughs of New York, and they have to band together to protect the city from a threat that is coming to get all of them. But the various boroughs, the actual boroughs, don't get along so great, and neither do their avatars, the people who represent them. And so even though they're supposed to be working together, various characters, such as especially Bronca and Brooklyn, fight. They just have quite a lot of arguments going on. And of course Bronca in general, who is representative of the Bronx, is quite a grumpy person and is the oldest of the group and doesn't appreciate her life being sort of invaded by all these people and all this stuff she now has to do. So she is a little bit aggressive towards the other characters, even though she knows that they all have to work together to save each other. This is also a little bit the case in We Hunt the Flame, in which we have kind of 3 groups of people coming together into a group of 5. And each one of them has a different agenda for going on this mission to find this place and this person. And they all have to journey together, but because of all their conflicting motivations, they have quite a few arguments and general distrust between them for a lot of the book, and they have to work on that to succeed. Then we have comorbidities. A comorbidity is where you have one medical or psychological condition and then you have another one on top of that, and they tend to interact with each other. For autistic people, there tend to be a lot of comorbidities, such as many autistic people will also have depression or anxiety or fibromyalgia or irritable bowel syndrome, sometimes bipolar, sometimes OCD, ADHD, various nerve conditions. Nobody really knows why. It's theorized that for anxiety and depression, these are related to how autistic people tend to be treated by neurotypical people and society at large, especially with the whole social skill lacking thing. We tend to get social anxiety because we have negative interactions with people when we don't understand them and they don't understand us. With depression, when we feel isolated from people, we get lonely. With things like ADHD, there's a big overlap of symptoms. With OCD too, like executive function being lacking and needing to complete rituals in order to not feel anxious. With things like fibromyalgia, it's theorized that we have overly sensitive nerves, and so when something gets painful, it is interpreted as being really painful instead of only a little painful. We really don't know why, but it is generally understood that it's something to do with the nervous system, because that includes both the nerves being oversensitive and also the brain working differently from neurotypical people's brains. And sometimes, like for me, I have anxiety, depression, irritable bowel syndrome, fibromyalgia. So when you add all these things on top of each other, you get what has been referred to in some articles about autistic people as medically complicated, which I really love that term. It explains how I feel so well. And it can just feel like you have all these different things that are going after you at various times. If your depression isn't bothering you today, now it's your anxiety. Or you feel really good in your head, but your body is in a lot of pain. And you never feel really good because one of your problems is always going after you. And so the prompt for Comorbidities is a book that kept kicking a character when they were down. You might be aware that a lot of authors like to do this. But the book that I've read that felt like it did that the most was The Deed of Paxenarian. This is basically a conglomeration of 3 shorter books, kind of like Lord of the Rings is a conglomeration of 3. And Paxenarian is the main character. She is a young woman who goes to train to become a mercenary and eventually does become a mercenary and travels with this group that she trained with, and basically journeys across the continent, going back and forth and doing all sorts of things, sometimes with her mercenary group, sometimes not. And basically a bunch of terrible things happen to her at various times. She gets assaulted multiple times. Loads of trigger warnings for this book. Her friends keep dying off. She ends up alone a lot. Her life is constantly in danger for one reason or another. And then at the end of the book, there is a really long, drawn-out torture scene, which personally I wish hadn't been put in, especially in so much detail. But the author talks about, around that section, how she thinks that showing people how horrible things can be helps them to not be so horrible. But I'm more of the opinion of agreeing with J.R.R. Tolkien that showing people horrible things happening makes them want to be more horrible. So he liked to cut out a lot of the violence, / gloss it over and not have much detail. And I'm more that sort of a person as far as thinking about how books affect a society, but also I just really prefer not to read torture scenes. They're really horrible. So like I said, triggers up the yin-yang for that one. Really cool woman power. She's an amazing lady fighter who don't need no man, by the way. There is a distinct lack of romance in this book. Then we have the fact that autistic people tend to be social rebels. We're more likely to not care what people think of what we wear or how we do our hair. There's one aspect of autism where we can't really conform to societal norms because we don't understand them or we don't get unwritten rules well. But there's also an aspect where we kind of like going against the norm and we kind of enjoy flouting social rules, because why would we care? And it's totally illogical to make changes to your life or what is actually a good idea to do or what you want to do based on what people will think of you. And so the prompt for that is to tell us about a book with a society / group of people with an excessive amount of rules that just are asking to be broken. So this could qualify pretty easily for any book in which the patriarchy is a thing, which is a lot of books, especially fantasy, because they tend to be set in times with less technology, and thus set in what a lot of people understand as an older time when sexism was really rampant. So you could pick any of those, but I'm going to pick Persuasion because it is historical fiction set in an actual time when people actually had these ridiculous rules for how women and men were to behave, but especially women. All of Jane Austen's books tend to take a look at social issues, including a lot of societal norms and rules and regulations for how people were allowed to interact with each other and what they're allowed to do. In Persuasion, the main character is convinced not to marry this man because he's not rich enough to match up to her social station. In Sense and Sensibility, there's an understanding that you can't break off an engagement without being a horrible person, even if you don't love the person you're engaged to anymore, because that will just totally upend a bunch of societal rules. And there are very specific ways in which you are allowed to talk to / be around the opposite sex. Not to mention strict gender rules in which non-binary people and trans people were ignored / mistreated quite a lot. Relatedly, there is this thing called ABA, which I can't even remember at the moment what that stands for, but it is basically this thing where an autistic child will be sent to classes where they will basically be brainwashed into conforming, like being forced to not stim and being forced to make eye contact and a lot of other things. And sometimes it can be a little beneficial in teaching social rules, but mostly it's pretty harmful. But a lot of autistic parents and society in general will say that this is great for the children because it will make them normal or cure them or make them able to do these things. And a lot of autistic adults are very much against this because we understand where the children are coming from and how uncomfortable it makes them to do these things they're being forced to do. Plus, we recognize that we still flap our hands and avoid eye contact, and we're perfectly fine that way. So the prompt for that one is a book where people were creepily controlling for a character's own good. And for a character's own good is in quotes. So examples that a lot of people would be familiar with would be Mother Gothel from Tangled, who is always telling Rapunzel that she's keeping her in this tower for her own good because it's dangerous out there, and Judge Frollo from Hunchback of Notre Dame, who basically keeps Quasimodo locked up in Notre Dame with similar reasoning, when it's really because they both want to maintain power over this person. But for a book that includes that characterization, I'm going to say Born in Ice, which is a book by Nora Roberts, and it is a romance. But the background of the romance is that the main character has a mother who had a very negative relationship with the father. Their first child was conceived out of wedlock and they were sort of forced to marry, and so this woman always kind of held it against him and the children that she was tied down to him. And now that she is older and her children are adults, she kind of uses the main character of this book as a workhorse and a little pawn. And she says that she's always loved this child and is trying to protect her and has acted in all these controlling ways to save her from men who would treat her badly, but has in fact been just trying to keep her single and close to herself so that she can use her as a dog's body. Then we have special interests. And special interests can be and have often been depicted as something where the autistic character only cares about one thing and they can only communicate to others using that topic, like trains or math. But for a lot of autistic people, it's just something they really, really like and enjoy spending time with. It really relaxes them usually, or gets them hyped up if that's how they want to be. I like to be relaxed. And it's only a little bit of a higher level than a normal typical person being super interested in something. My special interest is storytelling / language, specifically verbal language, which is why I can communicate things really well with words, cannot communicate things well at all with body language, and can only occasionally read body language. Like, I can tell if somebody's uncomfortable, but I can't then interpret why. And expressions of my special interest are running a channel on books, hence storytelling and language, and also being a writer and making my own stories via the English language, while also studying how the English language works to tell stories. And I'm also very interested in other languages and the differences and some things that can be expressed only in another language's words, because some connotations just don't exist in different cultures. But I can make conversation on other topics, and I don't spend every waking minute devoted to it. A lot of waking minutes, but not all of them. And people have totally varied special interests. Sometimes it's super specific, like sharks in the case of A Kind of Spark, which is a book about an autistic middle schooler. Could be art, could be theater. One of my autistic characters that I like to write about has a special interest in potion making. Basically because if potions were a thing that existed, that would be my special interest. And so the prompt for that is a character sufficiently obsessed with something that it would be their special interest if they were autistic. And I chose Creel from Dragon Slippers, who is super into embroidery. It's what she goes into for a living, and it is her art. And whenever she sees something really interesting in nature or in a dragon's hoard, for example, she gets super inspired. How can I turn this into an embroidery pattern? Autistic people also tend to have really high empathy. We tend to not be able to ignore the pain of others. So if someone tells us even about something that happened forever ago, like women being killed in the witch trials, once again in the case of A Kind of Spark, we get really upset and we can't just say, oh, it happened forever ago, it doesn't matter, or no one's doing that now, so it doesn't matter. We have trouble distancing ourselves from those people and not feeling for them and what it must have felt like. And when we hear about things going on in the world today where people are being hurt, it's really, really stressful for us, and we take on that pain, sometimes to an unhealthy extent. So the prompt for high empathy is a character who cares more about others' feelings than their own, / is always trying to take care of other people. And for that I have two, although these tend to be my favorite characters in any books. And those are Emily from the series Avalon, which is about 3 teenage girls who discover magic stones in a pond and discover that these give them some magical powers, and get drawn into a big interplanetary war thing going on in order to protect the refugees, who are magical creatures fleeing from a big bad guy who is destroying their worlds. And while all 3 main characters care a lot about these magical creatures and taking care of them, Emily, I feel, is the one who most embodies putting someone else before yourself, not needing the limelight, not even being a super go-getter fighting person, being mostly a nurturer. Then there's also Kelladry from the Protector of the Small series, and basically the title of that series sums up who she is as a whole. She is always working to protect the underdog, servants, animals, commoners, anyone who is kind of at the bottom of the pecking order, she will protect them. And she gets herself into a few scrapes because of it. So as I said earlier, autistic people tend to have overly sensitive nervous systems, and so it's theorized that that is why we have a lot of sensory sensitivities. Sensory sensitivities are, we can't stand to have itchy clothes. Some of us can't stand having our hair down or having makeup on. I can stand both of those things for a short amount of time, but usually not longer than a couple of hours. My hair is going right back up as soon as I'm done filming. We are also very sensitive to smells, tastes, textures, and sights, such as flickering lights. Give you a headache right quick. Buzzing sounds will drive us nuts pretty quick, along with beeping. Or if we have commercials running on one side, which are specifically designed to grab one's attention, while someone is talking to us from the other side, even that will get us to like, I can't concentrate on anything. And we tend to be very averse to some foods, especially based on textures, less so on taste. And of a lot of those, it's theorized that it's because it's not that one thing is so offensive, because usually all of us have different things that we don't like touching us or eating. It's more that our nerves are so sensitive that if we don't like something a little bit, our body will freak out a lot about it. And so the prompt for that is a character with supernatural / magical / enhanced senses that sometimes overwhelm them. Because there are a lot of characters in books that have super sight or super hearing, and sometimes authors explore how that can be a bad thing if they get overstimulated, but some authors just portray it as purely a good thing. And I've got two for this again. One is the main character from Stranger, whose name I can't remember right now, but he forms this sort of magical connection with a killer tree, and he can sense what is going on with this magical tree. But often when he senses stuff through that connection, he gets overwhelmed and he shuts down and tends to collapse. Another one is the elves from the Elven Alliance series, which I just read last month. The elves in this case have very sensitive taste. They can also see and hear really well and sense vibrations, but because of the whole strong taste thing, they can't eat spicy food or even particularly flavorful food. Then we have same foods. A lot of autistic people, because we are so sensitive to different types of food, we'll find a type of food that we enjoy and that doesn't make us throw up and that is at least medium healthy, and we'll just stick to that because it's safe and won't upset our stomachs or our brains, because we also just generally don't like change. And we will also come up with a sort of mental list of foods that we definitely cannot eat because that goes badly every time. An example for me is I really love a certain cereal and I have it every morning, and my stomach gets upset with me when I have something else for breakfast. Not necessarily because it doesn't like that specific food, just because it's different. I am also very safe with various types of pasta and bread, carbs in general. So those make up quite a bit of my diet. Things that I know to avoid include onions in almost any form, unless they have been cooked so much that they have basically disintegrated into the food, because it's the texture I don't like, not the taste. The taste is pretty good. So the prompt for that is a food that was talked about in a book that you want to eat and one that you definitely don't. So some books that talk about food a lot include Midsummer's Mayhem, which is about kind of baking magic. So because there are some magical powers in the food that is being baked, we get to hear about it a lot, particularly different flavors of cupcake, which I really like different flavors of cake, so I'm very into that. Another book that talked a fair amount about food, because the main character was a cook, which is usually the reason that happens, is Forbidden by Beverly Jenkins. In this case, the character is Eddie, and she very much wants to be a cook full-time, and she ends up being able to land a position, and so we get to hear about all the wonderful southern food that she makes, and I would like to try her cooking. Various books also will sometimes bring up really horrifying foods. Sometimes it's gruel and maggoty bread that you have to eat because you're a prisoner. In one case in the book Radiance, a dish is described that is a delicacy for a certain culture, but that is very horrifying for people of other cultures, and this is baked scarpatine, wherein there is a scorpion-like creature that is baked into a pie while alive, and you're supposed to stab it with your knife to kill it, because it's still alive even after being baked, and then you slice it up and eat it like that. I assume also with bits of pie next to it, because why else would you put it in a pie instead of just putting it on your plate straight? But anyway, pretty horrifying. Then we have the fact that a lot of us get a late diagnosis because of a combination of ableism and sexism, generally. That doctors believe that autism is one specific thing, and if you don't manifest that way, then you're not autistic. This especially happens with women because we mask more, so it can be less obvious. Masking, by the way, is where we make eye contact and don't stim and do various other things to fit in and look like a neurotypical, even though we're very uncomfortable with that on the inside. It can also be that because learning disabilities are also a comorbidity of autism that is fairly common, some people believe that if you don't have a learning disability, you can't be autistic, especially because a lot of what is portrayed on the media and a lot of autistic parents who talk a lot about their autistic kid being autistic have kids with comorbid learning disabilities. It can seem like that's the only type of autism there is, so if people get good grades, people can think, oh, you must not be autistic. But anyway, because of all these things, we tend to end up with a late diagnosis. So all our life up until then, we've been wondering, what is going on with me? Why do I have all this physical pain? Why am I so sensitive to different types of food? Why do flickering lights bother me so much? Why do I have such trouble reading body language? Why do I have such trouble figuring out what people want me to say in certain circumstances? And then it's a big aha moment when you finally figure out, I'm autistic. And so the prompt for late diagnosis is a character who had no idea what was going on until the end of the book. Like in the first episode of Ouran High School Host Club, which is an anime and a manga, one of the characters named Tamaki doesn't figure out something that everybody else in the episode figures out at various points sooner than him, that the main character of the manga slash anime is not a boy. But sometimes this happens in a story and the readers slash watchers don't know either, because everybody has been kept in the dark from some sort of plot twist that happens near the end. An example of this is Gilded Wolves. Throughout the book, there are a lot of different motivations and complications going on and conspiracies, and neither we nor the main characters figure out the whole story until the end. And even then, they don't quite figure out the whole story. They figure out a few more parts. And we think we know the whole story, but it's definitely possible that we don't, and then we're only going to find out more in the next book. We also have The Girl Who Drank the Moon, and in this case we have 3 different perspectives, maybe even 4, and a lot of them are either hiding information from each other or just don't know where the other is, or just don't have contact with the others. And so we get information that eventually puts together a whole picture of what is going on now and what has gone on in the past, but each of the characters only sees one bit of it, so they don't figure out the big sweep of what's going on until they all meet up at the end. And so that is all my questions. Obviously there are lots more symptoms and lots more to say about autism. There are whole channels dedicated to this. I will be linking some of them below because they are really great and helpful, both to autistic and non-autistic people, who are called allistic, by the way, if you wanted some more jargon to help you communicate on this. But I'm going to tag the 2 booktubers who I know are autistic and who don't mind talking about that, being Seiji from The Artist and Geek and Anna from Anna Goldberg. They are both really wonderful booktubers, and I would listen to them and like really enjoy just listening to them, even if I was totally uninterested in actually reading the books they were talking about, just because I liked the way they talked. And when they actually said that they were autistic, after I'd watched quite a few of their videos, I realized, oh, it's because their brain works so similarly to mine. Obviously no pressure to either of them if they don't do tags or if they're too busy or whatever. You don't have to have a reason not to do it. But I also have lots of other booktube friends, and I would love if anyone decided that they felt like doing this tag. And unlike if it's like a fantasy tag or a used book tag, I have no idea which of my booktube friends would be like particularly interested in doing this type of tag. So I just take everyone who feels like doing it. I really love you guys. Being able to talk to people about my special interest is really cathartic for me, and so I really appreciate this community who doesn't find making a half-hour video about books weird and are actually interested in what I'm saying. So thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video. Bye!